we're talking a lot about, okay, permission versus permissionless, right? And like what is the world supposed to look like when there is all this other assets and all this other activity that's moving on chain? To the point around, okay, well, there's a lot of DeFi activity that is still going to be needed and the infrastructure that's still going to be needed for that real world activity. Well, so far, we haven't seen near that amount of activity in the permissioned arena, right? So is Stripe supposed to interact with permissionless DeFi protocols, or are other sort of corporate entities supposed to do that? How do they do that if that's the case? Or do we expect that we're just going to a permissioned world of blockchains? Thank you, everyone, for being here. So, Rob Hadick, I'm a general partner of Dragonfly. If you don't know us, we're about $4 billion under management. We invest in and around crypto, stablecoins, anything that has to do with blockchain in general. DeFi going mainstream and kind of institutional DeFi, as people like to call it, is one of my favorite topics. And we have two of the best in the space who on the founder side here. So maybe Stani, Guy, have you guys introduce yourselves and your protocols?
Sure. So I'm Stani. I'm founder of the Ethena Labs, and we built the Aave protocol, which is a decentralized protocol for lending and borrowing. Currently have a 70 billion worth of net deposits. Out of that is 17 billion in stablecoins. So it's very stablecoins driven interest rate market. And more recently, we launched Horizon, which is essentially using tokenized assets as a collateral and borrowing stablecoins against these assets. So essentially using the same infrastructure and smart contracts we built for the permissionless world for native crypto assets, such as borrowing against Bitcoin and Ethereum. Now that infrastructure is applied to more traditional assets that are on chain. And obviously working quite a lot with Guy in a kind of like a project we call Ethena, where we see a lot of composability in DeFi. So as DeFi is an open world, these projects and innovations can actually be composed and benefit different types of use cases. Happy to be here.
My name's Guy Young, founder of Ethena. Before I founded Ethena around 2.5 years ago, I used to work in traditional finance. I was at a private equity fund called Cerberus, and they focused on investing across the capital structure into financial services, so banks, non-banks, payment companies, and those type of businesses. The idea behind Ethena was, can we create something that looks and feels a little bit like a stablecoin, but has a slightly different construction in terms of its backing and collateral that sits behind it? So what we do to collateralize the core product, which is known as USDE, is something that's known as like a delta neutral trade or like a basis trade. And essentially what you're doing is you're going long an asset on one side and then you're using derivatives to short on the other side at the same notional. And what you do in effect is create what we call a synthetic dollar position, where a movement in the underlying price doesn't affect like the solvency of you being able to maintain a dollar position. And one of the interesting byproducts of that is that when you're shorting derivatives within crypto, because everyone wants to be long derivatives and they'll pay a very large interest rate to be long, you can harvest a very interesting return while you're doing that and sort of tokenize it in a format that everyone's sort of used to, which is a stablecoin. So yeah, I guess the history since we launched, we came out with the product around 18 months ago now. It was the fastest growing dollar that ever reached $10 billion in supply. So we're sitting at roughly $13 billion now in around 18 months. And that's the third largest dollar issuer, just behind Tether, Circle, and then Ethena is number 3. And then we have a second product called USDTB, which is a bit more simple, plain vanilla, where we're essentially wrapping a stablecoin around BlackRock's BUIDL money market fund. And Ethena is the largest holder of BlackRock's product. That's sitting around just under $2 billion right now. And the idea is that Ethena is sort of like a full suite dollar product provider to crypto, where you might want something that's plain vanilla, easy to understand, like a normal stablecoin, or you might want something for a different purpose, which is USDE with a slightly different sort of risk and return profile. So excited to be here. And yeah.
Cool. So you both mentioned something that I think is pretty interesting, which is Aave, obviously the biggest lender and depositor money market in crypto. About, you said 28 billion of loans outstanding right now, 70 billion of total deposits. But you launched Horizon, right? And you see that at least as some sort of growth engine for you, which is your institutional product. Obviously, Guy, same thing. USDE, that's your core product, 13 billion, as you mentioned, but USTB you launched because also a more institutional like grade product, right? And so for both of you, what was your thinking in saying, okay, well, I have this great product that is growing, that is dominating DeFi, that we can continue to maybe do different types of distribution with, but I want to launch something else, something that's made more for institutions. What was the reasoning behind that? And what were the conversations like with those institutions or those, call it, people who are more mainstream, as we're calling the panel? What did they need to be able to get into your product and that DeFi and DeFi products generally?
Yeah, I think the concept of institution is really wide spectrum, right? So there's already institutions in using the permissionless DeFi, US Nasdaq listed companies that are somewhere involved in crypto. That might be, for example, Galaxy or similar type of market makers. And I think what is interesting, at least for me, is that I see there's like three different concepts of future of finance. And one of that is, for example, DeFi. And decentralized finance is kind of an environment where we're going to have the best financial opportunities, regardless of the backgrounds of the user bases. And obviously, a lot of finance is driven by institutions, so that's going to be an environment for institutional usage. And to access DeFi, what's really important is actually stablecoins. So stablecoins are the only way that users can access and institutions can access DeFi, consume different kinds of financial opportunities, whether that's, for example, borrowing against digital assets, and also at the same time extracting any type of yield opportunity, whether that's lending or basis trades at, for example, Ethena has. And third component that is really important to understand is the RWA, so tokenized assets. So the DeFi is very much driven by native assets, the Bitcoin and Ethereum, and being able to collateralize and obviously market cycles. So when the cycles are up, that drives a lot of capital, borrowing volume, and it increases demand for stablecoins and creates yield opportunity. And what I think is that interesting in the future is that we will still have these kind of native assets and native use cases, but over time, a lot of the value from traditional finance will move into DeFi in form of tokenization. And that's where RWAs come into play. And stablecoins are the way to then consume that liquidity or a use case. And it's quite a interesting moment at this point because we see already first experimentations of tokenization of assets. And I think this is kind of like a continuation of just finance evolving in a different substrate. So obviously, ages ago, we started with clay boards. We moved to paper. We moved to digital a few decades ago, and now we're moving on chain. And every single substrate or this medium brings new properties. So digital means that anyone can trade the same opportunity across globally and access that information. And then the blockchain provides the ability to add additional guarantees, best execution, remove middlemen, reduce operating expenses as these business models of finance are moving on chain, and increase the access to financial opportunities. And for institutions, this is a big opportunity. It's just a question of how to contribute into DeFi and RWAs.
Yeah, I think our thinking on the topic sort of originated from a place of frustration on my side where it sort of felt like the biggest tailwind this entire cycle was institutional capital coming to the space, ETFs around BTC and ETH, and there were just these incredible tailwinds around the entire sort of space. But DeFi as like an island didn't really see as much of the flows that you were seeing coming into ETFs basically, and then stablecoins. Even if you look at like very rough sort of figures, 2021, Bitcoin was obviously double the price that it peaked at in 2021. Tether supply more than double. And then DeFi TVL, as of like 2 months ago, was actually, 30, 40% below the peaks that you saw in 2021. And so for us, that was a pretty like eye-opening moment, which was we'd actually done a pretty poor job of, taking the products that we'd built and actually putting them in a format that was actually digestible from the flows of capital that were actually coming to the space to interact with things like ETFs and stablecoins. So I guess our perspective was, and having, worked in TradFi and speaking to those type of entities a fair amount, there's actually a pretty narrow set of things, which I think TradFi is actually interested in within crypto. I think it's kind of Bitcoin as a store of value, stablecoins, as Stani mentioned, and then tokenized assets. And if we dig into those second sort of two categories, there's actually a very different interest, I think, in those two pieces. Because if you think about tokenization, that isn't really actually something that like crypto natives are actually capturing any of the value from, right? So BlackRock is putting a money market fund on chain. Apollo is taking one of their funds and distributing it on chain. It's just a different distribution, platform and angle that these businesses can actually just reach a larger audience. It's not really like crypto natives producing something that's like unique and different out of crypto to actually push into TradFi. So I think the view that we took was Ethena's product is quite unique and it's actually based fully on crypto primitives. And this is just something that you cannot replicate yourself sitting within TradFi. You're essentially like harvesting an interest rate that is native entirely to crypto. And so I think the view that we had was that there is actually a lot of demand in the world for a dollar with double-digit yields. So for reference, Ethena's product in 2024 produced roughly 18% return annualized on zero volatility. And sort of like since the date that we launched to today, on average, that number's around 13, 14%. So if we take a step back and just say, what is the demand for a dollar with 14 to 18% return? That's not a 10 billion number. It's like a trillion type number. And it's really our job to actually put that in a format where we can sort of deliver it to those pools of capital. So I think for me personally, like where do I want to spend my time? It's less around how do we distribute existing products that already, live and work within TradFi to a slightly different audience within crypto. I'm not really interested in that. What I'm interested in is, can we create something that's like net new, doesn't exist in the real world, and then actually bring it out into TradFi in a format that they can actually engage with it.
So I want to pull in that thread a little bit because that's interesting, because you just said something I think actually polar opposite of what Stani said. Stani said, hey, I'm really excited about bringing traditional assets, tokenized assets on chain, right? You said, I actually don't care about those traditional assets. I want to make something net new that is financial primitives based on crypto, and I want to distribute them outside of crypto, right? And to other people. I guess, Stani, how would you react to that point a little bit? I think the common criticism is that, Janus Henderson, which I know is on the Horizon platform, they have a CLO product that's a little bit over $1 billion right now. And the all $1 billion is basically just collateral to the Maker or Sky stablecoin. They, have got another product, I think a money market product. But that looks maybe like, okay, well, I'm just finding a new person to buy a thing that, I am trying to distribute and I make, 2% on, or some, number of bips on, right? And that's maybe not a big market, right? Or guys saying, actually, the much bigger market is me taking something net new and distributing it to those people. How would you respond to that? And how do you think about, maybe that TAM or that addressable market for Horizon in that kind of framework?
Could I just qualify one thing before Stan jumps in? I think Stanley is one of the few people who is creating something that is net new out of tokenized assets. So taking an unlevered money market fund or an unlevered, Apollo ACRED fund is something that people can access normally themselves. When you put it on Aave and you're levering it up and, taking whatever tokenized asset that is there, that is a net new product that sort of falls out of that.
You gotta let me do a little, get a little spiciness going on here. Like, you don't have to, he can defend himself.
I think, there's something really to defend. Like, the stream is twofold in the sense that we have to see, like, the direction is going two ways, right? So we have to see tokenized assets happening and coming on chain. And at the same time, we have to see, these crypto native primitives also coming into the TradFi if there is a opportunity. So I think it's a two-way stream in that sense. I do agree with Guy in the sense that, what Horizon provides is the ability to have 24/7 repo market. And that is something that market makers, for example, don't have access as of today in the TradFi. And the more you tokenize these assets and larger diversity of portfolios you have more actually benefit from that. And Horizon today is over 100 million, not billions, yeah. but it's really significant after 1 week of launch. So it is a interesting development. And then the other way around of finding these kind of like a native crypto primitives and tokenizing, I do think it's also interesting, and that's something that I'm a big believer in. The challenge there is obviously to find a primitive that scales to billions of people, and you have to rely on these native crypto assets, which is DeFi is very much driven by DeFi yield by the trading of native assets such as, for example, Bitcoin and Ethereum. And if you think about like if the whole future is moving to this new financial medium from like electronic to or like digital into on-chain, all finance will exist eventually. And it's a question of what are these early adopters? And I do think it's not that exciting of selling necessarily a tokenized money market fund or a tokenized CLO to a DAO, but it's an interesting way of getting early liquidity seeded into these experimentations. And over time, I think the best way tokenized asset works if you get a network effect. So once you build towards a specific user base and provide better utility, and that way can increase actually the adoption. I think that's the way to grow tokenized assets. But bringing the same assets necessarily is going to be harder because at that point you're basically trying to sell to the same audience. There's not that many T-bill buyers once they already have been. You have these opportunities that exist already. So it's more of a two-way stream, to be honest. And I would say maybe at some point we will see a more TradFi fund version of the Aave native yield that already exists, that is just accessible to traditional like terminals for investors.
Yeah. Maybe Guy, going to you a little bit. So I think there's roughly $6 billion worth of Ethena assets on Aave right now. And they, but if you go like through the list on Aave, it's like, okay, well, I have USDE, which is, your core product, and staked USDE. And then you have these different maturation of the PTs, right? And you have also USTB, right? So there's a lot of people in this room who probably think that what I said is like nonsense, right? How do you make what you're doing and that new novel product actually accessible to like a broader set of people, right? Like, and make it easily digestible, because, people might know what, some sort of like a credit default swap is, but they don't know what a PT is, right? And is it just how we think about, talking about these products, or what does the packaging need to look like to actually bring institutions into these products?
Yeah, so I think there's one pitch, which is which is how do you pitch it and present it, and then one is like, reg-wise, operationally wise, how do you actually get them sort of plugged in and comfortable actually engaging directly. I think the funny thing is that we always think that we're inventing something new, but there's always an analog that actually sits within TradFi. So, Stani made reference to the repo markets on Aave. That is kind of what they're doing, and it does exist. And the PT markets, for those who aren't.
Can you actually, just for people here that don't know, define what the PT market is?
Yeah. So you can sort of think about it as called Pendle, where they're essentially taking any asset that has a floating rate of interest you can sort of plug in, and then someone will be buying at a discount, almost like a zero coupon bond, the principal. So essentially what you're doing is swapping a floating rate of interest or a stream of income going forward to just a fixed rate of return that sort of looks and feels a little bit like a zero coupon bond. So what's interesting about that is that there's a ton of volatility within interest rates within crypto. So you might wake up one day and interest rates are 50% to lend, and then the next day it's like sub T-bills, and that just sort of like obviously oscillates with prices in a pretty autocorrelated way. And so, yeah, one piece that's interesting there is you're essentially you don't have like any sort of form of interest rate curve or market within crypto until Pendle turned up, where you basically just have like spot interest rate markets that will be jumping day to day. What Pendle essentially introduced was the ability for us to say 3, 6, 9, 12 months out on the curve, where you're willing to actually lock in an interest rate, and then you can start to take those products and lever them up and, in Aave, use it as collateral to trade somewhere else and all those different pieces. So I think that's one area of DeFi where we're not even in like inning one. It's just like so unbelievably immature in terms of thinking about forward interest rate markets. And I think that's one piece that Pendle has brought that's new to the cycle in the last few years. So I think the second question is, so how do you sort of describe it to people? I think there is an analog for almost everything that's happening within DeFi. It's just you don't see it in the same, presented in the same way. The way that we think about this is that a large piece of how we think about distributing this product into TradFi is actually saying, can we put this in a format that they're used to? So we have a product that's called iUSD that's coming out, where essentially what we do is allow any asset manager, credit fund, hedge fund, anyone who's sitting within TradFi to basically set up an SPV where you can just take in fiat, turn it into USDC, and one click basically deposit it to come into USD. And essentially all you're doing is creating like a fund that sits on top of USD and replicating the exposure to what's being sort of held at the underlying level. And then the LPs who are sitting within, all those different entities that I described there are basically just getting a replicated exposure to the underlying, and they're never having to touch crypto rails underneath. You're just sort of sending fiat to like a GP in the same way that you would any normal fund. This is obviously just takes quite a bit of time to get people used to and comfortable with this. It's not as easy as just like throwing something in the wild like you do in DeFi normally, where you have to actually get through a lot of legal work, structuring and stuff to get that going. But yeah, I think that's a product where the potential upside, I think, is just even bigger than the entire product that we have right now. Because I think when you start to speak to entities within TradFi and say, what does 14, 15, 18% annualized return on dollars, how interesting is that? If you go and look at almost like any large multi-strat hedge fund in the world, like 10% is an extremely good year with close to like zero vol. And should be a place in your portfolio for something that looks sort of similar to what USD is doing. So we're extremely excited about the upside of that. It just takes a longer time than we would have hoped to sort of get it to market. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that Stani and I were talking about before this was these corporate chains. So you have the launch of Arc and Tempo. You have the launch of Robinhood says they're going to launch their own L2 using Arbitrum. You've announced a potential chain as well. I guess how do we think about call it core DeFi and using DeFi native protocols with instances like Horizon on Ethereum versus these new corporate chains and deploying on there? Do you expect there to be different user bases? Do you expect those things to be? You've talked a lot about liquidity flywheels, which are obviously tougher on brand new chains. How do you think those will potentially interact with the rest of the ecosystem? And do you actually think they're dead on arrival?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think Aave is now at 16 or 17 different networks, and the way we think about Aave is just a piece of public software that can be deployed anywhere, and if there is enough traction and some sort of a use case specifically for that, Aave should be everywhere where there's use cases and users. That's kind of like the philosophy. Obviously, having a lending protocol requires some sort of active management from like the risk perspective and also kind of like the governance side. So I think there is certain cost that comes in. So maybe smaller chain deployments doesn't really move the needle, especially because we see a lot of growth happening actually on the Ethereum mainnet. But we're trying to be pretty much everywhere and also beyond EVM. So we recently launched Aave. We wrote it in Move and launched it in Aptos. And that was the first step for the Aave ecosystem to actually go beyond EVM. But when it comes to actually the more of these corporate chains, which I don't think is a bad idea in the sense that if there's a specific network effects and users that you can tap into, and I think Stripe is a great example where they already power incredible amount of merchants and businesses, and they can actually provide value added for that as well. And I think in Circle's case, there's certainly something that they can do in terms of like payments and stable coins and create an ecosystem. But it's really hard to grow a chain from ground zero, and it requires a lot of incentivization and flywheels. And I think that's something that we've seen in DeFi is that the liquidity follows the incentives, and I think the winners are the ones that have the deepest distribution. And I'm actually more kind of like concerned for the first generation of stable coins like USDT and USDC, because mainly that's volume is driven by the usage of on centralized exchanges, and DeFi, but they don't have that end user distribution, which actually then matters at the end the most.
So do you think Stripe should launch their own stablecoin?
I don't know. I think, well, the thing is that if you have a stablecoin, you control the underlying yield. So, if you have an ecosystem where there's someone else's stablecoin and you're not capturing the yield, you're basically losing money at that point. Right. So in that sense, you should have some sort of. But I think Stripe position is very unique because I do think they are looking to have a certain amount of neutrality and introduce other stablecoins and kind of like a believe in this like a more world of like multiple stablecoins. And I think that's the right way. In some ways, stablecoins are somewhat like payment rails. So you can accept USDC. Once you get the USDC, you convert it to your own stablecoin and you capture the yield essentially. That's maybe one way to think about it. So stablecoins as a payment rails. And I think that probably makes sense to have that, and also as a kind of like a way to capture also liquidity.
Okay, what do you think about these corporate chains and your potential interaction with them?
Yeah, so I think to date I kind of see like two real use cases of blockchains. I think speculation, casino type activity, which is kind of where Solana and Hyperliquid now have found success. Like Solana on trading spot meme coin type stuff is sort of the majority of the activity that you see there, and then derivatives sit on Hyperliquid. And those are kind of the two most successful versions of chains that we've seen outside of Ethereum. And then I think the second use case is movement, storage, settlement of digital dollars and tokenized assets. So I think Ethereum and then Tron, which is not that many people know about, is actually sort of the most popular chain for moving stablecoins around. I think the complexion of what people are using and what we define as like a successful outcome actually changes through time, where if you actually believe the crypto thesis and you believe that like trillions of dollars of assets are moving on chain, you have to believe that that speculative use case that we described of like casino type activity becomes a much, much smaller proportion of like global activity that you see on chain. So it wouldn't make sense that Solana meme coin trading is even like comparable to the movement of like all the stuff that Stani and Rob have been talking about in terms of bringing trillions of dollars on chain as tokenized assets in 10 years time. And if it is, then I would sort of consider everything we've done like a massive failure. So I think the way we sort of look at and define what does success actually mean, I think it's less of like a consumer-facing interaction that people have going forward. So if we look at what Stripe's doing, I think it's an incredible idea that makes a huge amount of business sense for them. But it's really them just making their stack more efficient, owning more of the stack, and almost sort of like undercutting a network in the process of doing that. So I think the way that you see like corporate entities coming in and using the stacks like that, it's actually just to improve their businesses, like marginally own a different piece of the stack that they didn't own before. And it's not something that a consumer is waking up and going, I can't wait to get into like Stripe's chain to go trade meme coins. It's just not really like the outcome that they're trying to sort of achieve. So yeah, I think that it makes a ton of sense for them as a business. But the way that we sort of think about success on these things, I think looks very different, where if it's like basically just running new backend infrastructure for yourself, I think success is just defined as like, are you creating efficiencies, doing things in a better way than you were before, rather than, finding 1 million retail users that want to come and trade on a chain.
I do think that one thing is interesting is that a lot of these chains, they will still need the kind of like a same infrastructure that exists in DeFi. So they need lending protocols, they need DEXs, and they need a lot of the infrastructure there. And I think it's because DeFi is very unique and on-chain in the sense that the liquidity really drives into places where you get capital efficiency and you have volume essentially, and that's something that's, I think, even if you think about Stripe's kind of like a more like a wider business model and like payments, I do think that in the future you also need lending and availability of exchanging assets and doing it as kind of like a capital efficient way as possible. So DeFi will be like plugged into these networks as well.
But So maybe, and actually, Guy, I want to start with you here because Stani and I were talking about this, but I've let him kind of go first. So I want you to maybe set the tone. We're talking a lot about, okay, permission versus permissionless, right? And like what is the world supposed to look like when there is all this other assets and all this other activity that's moving on chain? To the point around, okay, well, there's a lot of DeFi activity that is still going to be needed and the infrastructure that's still going to be needed for that real world activity. Well, so far, we haven't seen near that amount of activity in the permissioned arena, right? So is Stripe supposed to interact with permissionless DeFi protocols, or are other sort of corporate entities supposed to do that? How do they do that if that's the case? Or do we expect that we're just going to a permissioned world of blockchains?
Yeah, so I don't know the details around what it takes to sort of run a payments business compliantly, like on-chain. So that piece I don't actually know in terms of what they need to do from a permissioning perspective to sort of make that work. I think the perspective that I have is that you need to be very careful when you start to introduce permissioning, because it starts to just resemble, why not actually just use a database rather than a blockchain at all? So whenever we've sort of thought about when does this actually make sense, for us it's more actually at the app layer, which is saying you kind of want everything to be permissionless at the base layer, but if you need to introduce a piece of KYC or AML or something like that, that might sit at the app layer. I think what Stani, Horizon, I think is the perfect example here, which is if you have an institution that comes in and says, do you want to buy a tokenized interest in my fund, but not everyone in the world can just buy in here without any KYC, you might want to introduce that sort of small permissioning layer that actually sits at the application level before someone can interact. So I think that that's the view that we have, where there's a reasonable middle ground between permissioned and permissionless. But I think for use cases as big as sort of like payments and settlement sort of on-chain, I don't know enough around what even Stripe is thinking about for Tempo.
I mean more broadly, but obviously, like I think there's an expectation too, right? That Robinhood's chain will probably just be the Robinhood front end, right? And like, is there an ability for them to deploy Aave on Robinhood's chain, right? Same thing with Stripe. And I think the question is really a little bit around like ethos as well. So like crypto has grown on the back of permissionless access, right? Like Stani, you're from that era, and Guy, you're a little bit newer, but the world seems to be, and you guys are both kind of putting your protocols behind this idea that the next phase of growth is more institutional, right? And if that's the case, the crypto looks a lot different then than it does now. And does that have to be true? Or is it that we can kind of find a middle ground?
I see like the permissionless, like, I could come here and like, preach about the DeFi ethos and like permissionless and like, that everything needs to be like wide and open, and like that's what I stand for personally, no question about it. But I do think that the permissionless aspect, I would rather like to see kind of like and pitch it from like the business perspective. So like if you are able to convince people, whether it's like compliance team or regulator or your colleagues and your organization of actually operating in a permissionless environment, that can be a really big business case. Just to think about something like, payments. If you are able to be a fintech company and operate in payments and settle on stablecoins, and if someone has your organization's issued stablecoin, they leave the application but are still holding the stablecoin, they're still essentially in your ecosystem, and you can build more wider than the kind of like captive user base. So I kind of see like the business opportunity here being actually really valid. And obviously the challenge for this whole like permissionless and permission world is that obviously permissionless world drives more liquidity adoption because there's less bottlenecks. Like if you have to ask someone every single time you trade or get a approval, have onboarding, those are all friction, and they exist for a reason, obviously, because of the compliance or some other legal reasons. But the matter of fact is that permissionless world is more liquid, and like that's should be the North Star. Whether we get there and how fast, that depends quite a lot. But I do think there's a lot of value in this permissioned world in the sense that, and doing it in a right way. I don't think the market itself, like Guy said, that you don't need like market infrastructure that is permissioned. But like if you issue assets, you can have some sort of like a permissioning eligibility on the asset level, and then use these assets in a more permissionless way, and kind of like have some sort of liquidity aggregation there. But my kind of like a long-term hope is that we go into a world where all the assets and all the liquidity can move freely, and the faster, the better, in my opinion. But obviously, we live in a world where we have to ensure that we do things responsibly and securely, from like the compliance perspective, and also ensure that these DeFi protocols by themselves, become battle tested and more secure. That we can deploy more capital, we get better arguments why permissionless DeFi, is safe and secure and it's low risk, and that takes time, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I think the middle ground is permissioning at the asset and app layer, and I think when you start to introduce that kind of stuff to the base layer in a fully permissioned way, I think the question is just, why don't you do this on a database? Yeah.
All right, I think we've got maybe a couple minutes. So last question. What is your most controversial take, each of you, around the future of DeFi going mainstream or institutional DeFi? My controversial take would be that basically all of these corporate app chains don't work, right? And they all end up actually going back to some version of Ethereum or some maybe an L2, but like if it's an L1, they don't work by themselves.
Okay, that's a really good one, and I think that's really fair. I do think that L2s are very interesting, very interesting strategy and way to scale. But also there's this idea of like the world will be full of networks, so we can have a lot of L1s and L2s, and I think eventually we'll follow the scale of economics and maybe like consolidate into like handful of main networks, and I think Ethereum will be really important there, and I think that's having some sort of like a more neutral approach helps there quite a lot, because a lot of these corporate chains, they start as a really interesting ideas and as a way to consolidate the whole stack that you might have, but there's always business interest involved, and I think that the best networks and network effects happen when you have a really level playing field, and that also means that you have some sort of a way where there's no corporate interests dictating the kind of like a whole network. So I think that's why Ethereum is going to be in a really interesting position going forward if we see more of these L1s popping in, and I think the kind of like a most level playing field might be the best place to actually see innovation. And the difference between fintech and everything else we built in finance in the past versus on-chain and DeFi is that being able to build on-chain is you have really like low access to participate. And if you just look at us here, today, like we come from backgrounds where very small startups that I started Aave basically still being in university and coding there. So like the barrier is very low, and you can achieve a lot by innovating and building. And that's why I think neutral kind of like a platform or like a network is where we see most of the developers just keep coming in.
Yeah, I think I agree with your sentiment that the majority of the sort of corporate chains will fail, but I think that's just a statement that's broadly true with most chains that try to come to market. Like you tend to see a bit of a power law sort of distribution in these things where 2 or 3 I think will be extremely, extremely large, like $1 trillion outcomes, and I think the rest of them sort of fail to get material traction. I think one that's maybe slightly different is there's been a lot of interest in tokenized equities that coming on chain, and then people sort of trading spot tokenized equities. So you've seen that with Kraken, a few of the issuers. Robinhood's obviously spoken about it quite a bit. I think that is not going to be successful. I think it's like the incorrect form factor that people actually want to trade these assets. So I think it's super inefficient, expensive, and kind of worse than what you can do in the real world. But I do think the actual form factor for where equities gets a lot of traction within crypto is through derivatives on perpetual swaps. So I don't think it makes sense that retail leverage speculation on equities is done through options. So if you see the way that retail sort of trades equities on Robinhood, what are they trying to do? They're just trying to express a levered long view by buying a call. They're not trying to underwrite like volatility, underwrite the Greeks while they're doing that. And who sort of benefits from that is just Citadel sort of sitting on the other side taking a spread. I think this is actually one of the few unique crypto primitives, which is just like outright better than anything that you see within TradFi, which is the perpetual swap. And I think that like linear leverage that you get through that instrument on equities is like $100 billion plus opportunity. So I think people are like interested in how equities touch crypto, but I think the form factor that they're coming in now is 100 times less interesting than the opportunity that sits there with perpetual swaps on the same asset.
Cool. Well, let's give these guys a round of applause and thank you for being here.